Welcome to the Real News. I'm Eddie Conway, coming to you from Baltimore. Recently, I have been looking at the relationship between African Americans and the Chinese, and the relationship between China and the nations of the African continent. So joining me today to give us an overview of that relationship is Dr. Robeson Frazier. He's an associate professor at Amberhurst School of Communications and Journalism at the University of Southern California. He is also the author of The East is Black, Cold War China in the Black Radical Imagination, which explores Black American political relationship with Communist China during the Cold War. Professor Frazier, thanks for joining me.
Oh, it's a pleasure to join you today.
Also, the spread of Chairman Mao's Red Book seemed to have played a key role in our development and organizing, and it looks like it was also involved in the liberation movements in Africa as well as in South America. What happened with that? Is that Red Book still important today? What's the outcome of that?
So that's a great and fascinating question. I mean, actually, to also refer to your previous question, when you were talking about and mentioning Robert Franklin Williams, he and his partner Mabel Williams, another extremely important Black radical activist, thinker, internationalist, both of them. I think, well, the circulation even of Mao's Red Book, Robert Franklin Williams, is a central. He and Mabel Williams are a central factor too in the Red Book's ability to travel and take on a certain kind of political, cultural capital, in places beyond China throughout the 1960s and 70s. So, from my studies, when people like, the young men and women who established the Black Panther Party for self-defense, the young Black men and women who established organizations like the Revolutionary Action Movement, the Congress of African People, like, the works, one of the works that they're reading, are the writings, the ideologies, the arguments of Mao Zedong. And so it's particularly interesting how, his positions about protracted struggle, about revolutionary praxis, about tactical alliances, about united fronts, how that takes on a certain kind of currency and value in places, and in political context beyond that of China throughout this period you're referring to. And I think today, while the book maybe doesn't, and those works don't have the same amount of currency, at least within the U.S. I mean, I still find, in my relationships and conversations with organizers, activists who are part of radical organizations, they too, reading Mao's works and trying to figure out and center how these ideas might be applied within the specific, national, local context of their own work. So it's interesting, that this book, which really becomes, like, especially after it's translated in the late 1960s, I mean, people, I mean, I talked to my uncles, who refer to the ways that it just took on a certain kind of power and currency and capital, in terms of, being able to juxtapose different kinds of political beliefs and outlooks, in Harlem, in Baltimore, and Philadelphia in the late 60s and 70s. But even today, as I said, like how people are still pulling from it.
Okay, well, let's leap forward a minute, because I'm concerned with the relationship now of China and the continent, the African nations. Do you have any kind of opinion of what's happening over there now in terms of the relationship and interaction between Black Africans, or Africans in the diaspora in particular, and Chinese expansion into Africa?
Well, number one, I think it's you're seeing different kinds of developments in different countries. So China is more heavily involved and active in specific countries, but I do think we're seeing right now a serious kind of prioritization among the Chinese government, among Chinese corporations, and really expanding their economic footprint within the continent. As you and I were talking about before, in terms of like providing resources, money for infrastructure development, um, you know, uh, uh, working to expand the footprint of different kinds of Chinese technological devices, cell phones, within various African countries, kind of national marketplaces. I mean, we're also seeing it from the other side in terms of China's efforts to, gain access to various African natural resources. I mean, simply the kind of, minerals that are utilized within our cell phones. So I think there's a serious kind of a investment, by the Chinese state and corporations in Africa. And that's really kind of that isn't new. I mean, China has been really prioritizing Africa since the 1960s. We can go back to the Tanzam Railway, and one of the benefits, at least early on, of China's efforts in Africa was that China was willing to provide interest-free loans. So for many African nations, they looked at the Chinese as you know a an important alternative to that of the IMF or the World Bank, or the kind of U.S. model of globalism, which is really neo-colonialism, neo-imperialism. But I do think kind of that what we're seeing in China right now, I don't know. Some folks actually refer to it as kind of like China's own neo-colonial project in Africa, and they are it's clear the relationship is extremely uneven. The relationship is extremely lean towards China's own interests, China's ability to dump surplus goods, in African countries, China's ability to, they're dealing with serious labor issues, so they're able to reposition workers, Chinese workers, in Africa to, build roads and build stadiums that no one ever uses, build hospitals that at times, the hospital's built, but there's been no development of human skills where, there can be doctors, African-based doctors to actually work in those hospitals. So the relationship is extremely uneven, but I do think what we're witnessing there is something also unique and distinctive, and we're still trying to cultivate the right kind of language and frameworks to make sense of it.
Okay, I was in Africa a couple of years ago and had the opportunity to come in close proximity to a lot of Chinese workers, as well as some of their cultural events. And it felt to me that they were standoffish. Is this something about their cultural, historical cultural behavior, or is there a distance now between the Chinese workers that's in Africa, as opposed to how the Chinese were operating in Africa in the 60s and the 70s, or when they were interacting with the young nations that were being liberated and supported?
Well, I definitely think there's a difference. I mean, one of the clear differences, at least in the 60s, it was represented and framed through the notion of, revolutionary solidarity, solidarity for the sake of upending, colonial and imperial relations, and the Chinese were also pretty active in, showcasing this kind of solidarity, not just through, economic military support, but also, through cross-cultural exchange. So, and I'll say this, it was oftentimes more lean towards, Africans coming to China, for instance, to study, and receive bachelor's degrees and master's and professional degrees in particular kinds of subjects. So it was more lean towards, Africans going to China as opposed to Chinese going to Africa to engage and delve into African, the cultures of different African countries and nations, But nonetheless, it was still oriented around a kind of sense of sharing of culture, and the role that culture could play in fostering political alliance solidarity. I think today, I mean, as you described, I think what we're seeing more of is, Chinese companies, for instance, kind of coming into African countries and really, kind of sequestering, segregating their workers. I mean, like they basically, I mean, I'm sure you probably saw this. They build these kind of compounds where their workers kind of operate. And to some degree, it's almost as if it's their own kind of like mini version of China within, Angola or Tanzania or one of these, and as a result, that prevents any kind of sharing of culture, any kind of communication about difference. And you're right. As a result, these relations are far more economic than cross-cultural. But I think that's one version of it, because I do think there also are Chinese entrepreneurs who've moved to various African countries and that's become their home. So there are also Chinese kind of enclaves in various countries, and we've seen and it's more so Chinese men who are marrying African women, and having mixed race children. But it's interesting to see this kind of development where the Chinese men are kind of becoming part of African communities, and I'm interested to see there, like, what their lives are like, what their wives' lives are like, what are their children's lives like, and how is this producing different kinds of Chinese-Africa relations that oftentimes don't get highlighted, for instance, in news media. That oftentimes it's either framed through the kind of lens of, the U.S. saying the Chinese are over there kind of fostering neo-colonialism and imperialism in Africa, or it's from the Chinese kind of state narrative of, look at all that we're doing there, look at look how fruitful these relations with China are. And I'm far more interested in the kind of in the gray, where we can recognize that this is an extremely uneven set of relations, but at the community level, there's far more complexity in terms of actually what's transpiring.
Okay, Dr. Frazier, thanks for giving us an update on the past relationships and the present relationships between China and Africans and African Americans. Thanks for doing that for us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Okay. And thank you for joining The Real News.